Hi, I'm Jim Huling, and welcome to this edition of Execution Insights, the podcast. This podcast is where leaders can step away from all the noise and all the urgent priorities of leadership, and for a moment, we can go deeper into what truly makes a leader great, so that whatever we build from the inside out not only matters, it lasts. Let's get to it. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Huling, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Execution Insights, the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about patience. I know it's one of those qualities everyone says leaders should have, but very few people really understand what it means. In fact, most of us, when we think about patience, we imagine sitting back, waiting passively, or holding still until something changes. But that's not patience, that's hesitation. True patience is something very different. It's not weakness, and it's not indecision. In fact, patience is a discipline of readiness. It's the choice to hold steady, to resist rushing, to wait until the right timing appears so that you and I, when we act, we can deliver the best response in the right tone at the perfect moment. Now, the challenge for all of us is that most leaders today, especially, are rewarded for speed. Isn't that the truth? We're expected to make quick decisions, take immediate action, deliver fast results. But the truth is this: the right action at the wrong time is still the wrong action. And in today's world of pressure and pace, it's a lesson we can't afford to ignore as leaders. A few years ago, I was asked to work with a senior executive in another country. She had a very impressive track record. In fact, I was a little humbled to be coaching her. She was so well respected. She was highly regarded, successful, promoted into a new role all the time, and most recently into the most senior role she'd ever had, with very high expectations. But almost immediately, when she got into this role, things began to unravel. Her performance slipped, her team got really frustrated, and whispers started. You know how they do. And it turned out that people had lined up on both sides of the debate, some for, some against. And truthfully, the CEO who was calling me was leaning toward letting her go or moving her into another position. In fact, I was brought in as what he called the last resort. It's not my favorite way of being labeled, by the way. But in that conversation with the CEO, I asked him quite openly, is she the wrong person for the job? Or do you think she's just using the wrong playbook? Now, what I really meant by that was, honestly, is the problem one of character, or is it one of competence in some area? Now, I could tell that the question landed hard, partly because it was one he had not been thinking about. And he wanted the answer to that question. In fact, he needed the answer to that question before he could feel clear enough to make such a significant decision that would not only affect this valued member of the team, but also possibly ripple through the whole organization. So when she and I began working together, it quickly became clear that what was happening were the pressures of the new role. They had pushed her far outside of her comfort zone. In fact, they had pushed her into a place where the stress fractures were beginning to show. And in her most stressful moments, well, there's no other way to say it, she was reacting quickly and badly. It's a bad combination. She was reacting in ways that were leaving scars on the people on her team. Now, for all of this, here's the real key as I saw it. The work we began wasn't fast. In fact, it couldn't be. It was slow and often painful. But that's what patience looks like. not like standing still, but like holding steady, resisting the urge to rush and making space for real change to take place at the root rather than on the surface. Now, to tell this story truthfully, at first she resisted. She wasn't happy to be working with me. She wasn't happy to need to be having a coach in this early stage of a brand new role for her. And so, quite naturally, she blamed her team. She even blamed the culture and the CEO and the circumstances she had inherited with a long list of problems created by her predecessors. Now, part of what made this hard also is that she had always been successful. In fact, she said, I have an unbroken track record of success. So how could the problem possibly be me? Well, my heart went out to her, a genuinely good person, somebody I really wanted to be able to help. So little by little, through honest, authentic, heartfelt conversations, and a lot of using the discipline of patience, she began to see some patterns. And what she saw, honestly, wasn't just about work. In fact, she confided in me one day that as she began to see these reactions, she noted she was also doing some of those same reactions at home. In fact, the same issues that were sabotaging her leadership were also straining her relationships. Now, that's when I introduced her to a book that's been life-changing for me and for many of the clients that I've coached. Some of you hearing this video will nod your head that I've been a person who sent you this book and we've been through it together. And of course, I'm talking about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. We went through this book chapter by chapter together, slowly. And I'll never forget the day when we got to this famous insight. Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Gosh, I think it's one of the most amazing, life-changing quotes I've ever read. It was for me, it has been for many of my clients. And for my client on this day, this wasn't just a quote. This was a breakthrough, a cracking open of a limiting belief she had refused until now to let go of. Well, from that moment forward, she began practicing what we started calling claiming the gap. Now, it's a phrase I use a lot now in my coaching. Again, if any of you are my coaching clients, you've heard me say this, claim the gap. And what we mean when we say that is that we're referencing the space between a triggering moment, somebody said something or did something, and how we choose to respond. And at first, because she was so conditioned to just react, we had to begin with something incredibly simple. So the first way we applied Viktor Frankl's insight was that she would simply take a breath before she spoke. Now, that may sound easy, but honestly, it was hard. But over time, that practice of simply breathing grew into a real pause, a pause before she would speak, a pause to think about her answer, a pause to think about the outcome she wanted her answer to create. In other words, it was the truest application of the discipline of patience. Over time, she learned to use that space, not just to react, but to resist this urge of old habits. And instead of those old habits, a quick response, a sharp word, sometimes a criticism, she began to use the response with greater intention. In other words, she really thought about what she wanted to say before she said it. And that space that started with just breathing and went on to intentional actions, well, that's what we call patience. You see, patience isn't passive waiting. Patience is readiness. It's not indecision, it's timing. And it's not delay, it's real commitment. Now, slowly, her leadership began to change and people began to notice. I mean, her team noticed at first her steadiness, her willingness to hear them out, her new clarity in decision making. And that trust began to rebuild in all the relationships that she had. And so did her own confidence in herself. The happy ending to this story is that her turnaround wasn't the result of a quick fix. It was the fruit of patience. The patience of her CEO, who gave her one more chance at a little bit of urging from me. The patience of our work together, step by step, rebuilding patterns of responding, and her own growing patience with herself as she learned to pause, claim the gap, and then lead from a place of strength rather than reaction. One of my favorite authors is Leo Tolstoy, and he once said, "The two most powerful warriors are patience and time." I love that quote, don't you? The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. And I think the message of Viktor Frankl's stimulus and response space shows us that growth and freedom are found in that gap between the moment when something triggers us and the moment when we respond. I also can't help but quote one of my favorite basketball coaches, the legendary John Wooden, who said something very similar, but in a kind of more modern language. He liked to say, "Be quick, but don't hurry," right? Which means, take action, be decisive, but don't hurry in the sense that you do it without intention, reflection, or thought. Now, all three of these great quotes point to the same truth, patience is not hesitation. And by the way, one more time, patience is not weakness. Patience is a discipline of readiness. It's also a discipline of timing and commitment. And leaders who learn to claim that gap end up leading with clarity and with a kind of steadiness and strength, even in the midst of great uncertainty. So if you'll allow me, I just want to take one more minute and bring this even closer to home. Think about the last time you and I, as leaders, rushed into a decision, or we reacted in the heat of the moment and later thought, "Oh, wow, I wish I'd paused." I would recall that statement if I could, or maybe even in the worst case, we needed to go make an apology. You see, in every one of those moments, the pause, the space, is what patience gives us. And despite what many people think, patience is not passive. As we've said, it's a discipline of readiness. Now, let me be clear, I'm not talking about delaying out of indecision when we don't know what to do and we're sort of in a panic and we're bouncing from idea to idea or getting too many opinions on what we should do. No, I'm talking about holding steady to ensure we choose the right timing. I'm also talking about delivering the best possible response in the right way and at the perfect moment. Now, that might sound a little challenging, but I promise you with practice, it can be mastered. So let me leave you in this podcast with 3 questions that I urge you to carry into the week ahead and assimilate deeply into your own leadership style. The first, where in your leadership right now are you rushing? Even if people don't know, you're rushing when patience might actually produce a better outcome. That's number 1. Number 2, what relationship in your leadership or your team or even in your life could be healed by claiming the gap and starting to choose a better response with real intention? And third, how might patience, now remember, real disciplined patience, become your greatest strength in the season you're in? I hope you remember this from this podcast. Patience isn't weakness, it isn't hesitation, and it's not waiting. Patience is a discipline of readiness. And it's a discipline that enables us to choose the right time, the right action, the right way. See, that's the leader's power of patience. And that's what it means to claim the gap. So I want to thank you for listening to this podcast today and being part of this growing community of Execution Insights family. I'm Jim Huling, and I'll see you in the next episode of Execution Insights, the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today on this episode of Execution Insights, the podcast. And by the way, if you know someone who might be encouraged or helped by this message, don't forget to share the link with them and invite them to join us as well. I'm Jim Huling, and I'll see you in the next episode of Execution Insights, the podcast.